Macros on the Blackmagic ATEM allows you to complete complex tasks at the touch of a single button. Have you ever been in that situation where you need to unmute your microphone, cut to a camera, bring on some graphics, change a Supersource layout, all at the same time, and you realize you just don't have enough hands to do everything at once? That's exactly what macros were designed to solve. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to make them and show you some of my top macros to use in 2023. Firstly, then a quick explainer as to what a macro is. And you can think of it a bit like a set of actions that you can recall or run whenever you need. And it's just one press of a button. And macros are kind of split up in the ATEM in two sections. You firstly record the macro, and then whenever you need it, you run it. So with recording, you can think of it a bit like the ATEM monitoring and watching what you're doing or what you're changing on the device. So it might see that you've unmuted a particular microphone or cut to a camera or brought on some graphics by turning on the DSK, for example. It watches what you're doing when it's recording a macro and notes all of those things down and saves them to a file. And then once you hit stop recording, it will actually create that button that we talked about, one press button, so that when in the future you need to do all of those things again, all you do is press that one button and it will repeat that task, and you can use that button as many times as you want. And you can even create much more complex macros with timings involved as well. So it can do one thing and then pause for a few seconds, then do another thing. And you can start to build up these really complex macros that are super useful to just hit one button in a production and it do multiple things. With the ATEM software control open and your ATEM connected, if you go up to the macro tab here at the top and click on that and then open the macro palette, you'll see this screen, and I'll just very quickly explain what you're seeing here. So first of all, at the top, you've got two tabs, the create tab and the run tab. Pretty self-explanatory. You create and record your macros in the create tab, and then when it comes to running them and using them within a production, you do that in the run tab. So down at the bottom here, we've actually got a number of tabs, and you can navigate through them, and these are all the slots that you have for actually storing your macros. You can have up to 100 macros stored onto your ATEM. And then each of these slots you can record a macro in. So let's look at recording a macro straight away. First little tip I'm going to give you is you can actually click on one of the empty spaces and designate that as where you want the next macro to record, that you're recording to be. And if you don't click on one, it will just automatically place that macro in the next available space. Why this is important is for those ATEM Mini Extreme or Extreme ISO users, you'll note that you've actually got 6 macro buttons, physical buttons that you can use to run macros on the front of your device. So you're going to want to place your most important macros, or the ones that you use the most, in your first 6 slots here within the software. And then you're going to be able to trigger them using those buttons. So I'm going to click on this little second space here and then click the create or the plus button to actually start creating my macro. The first macro we're going to create is actually one that is going to transition whatever camera is on preview to program. It's also going to unmute mic 1 in the ATEM, and it's going to turn on the DSK so that we can have some graphics. And this is something that I would usually create as a macro for the start of show. So I can hit one button, it does all of those things to start the show. So we're going to give our macro a name. I'm going to call it start show here. And then as soon as we hit this record button, the ATEM is monitoring and recording all of the state changes and all of the things that we do on the device. So let's hit record. And now as you can see here, our screen has a red box around it. And now we can actually start doing the changes that we want. So the first thing that we're going to do is actually do a transition here. So I'm going to click the auto button. I've already got my camera 1, which is the camera that I want to transition to. I've got that in preview ready. So we're going to click the auto button. Then the next thing I want to happen is I want the audio on mic 1 to be unmuted and turned up. So let's go over to the audio tab here and let's just turn on mic 1 down here. And then finally, all at the same time, if we go back to the switcher tab, I also want to bring on my DSK graphics. And I want to do that so it fades on and not just cuts on. So I'm going to click this auto button here under DSK1. And you can see when I do that, it brings on our little live bug in the top right-hand corner as well. Now that we've done those 3 things that we want the ATEM to remember, we can actually stop recording the macro now. So we click the little record button again. And you can see now we have our start show macro here in the software control. So I'm going to just manually reverse all those things that we did. So we turned on the DSK, we can turn off the audio, and we can auto transition again back to me. So we're back to our original state. And what I want to show you is actually running the macro to show that with one button, we now can do all those three things at the same time. So we're going to go over to the Run tab here in the macro palette. And a little tip, I personally like to use this recall and run function. What it means is without it switched on, you need to click the macro that you want to run and then hit the play button. But if you have this recall and run function turned on, all you need to do is press or click the macro that you want to run and it will run. You don't have to do that second step of clicking the play button. So let's hit start show. And you can see now we've transitioned over to the overhead camera. Our graphics have turned on. And if we go over to audio, you can see my mic 1 audio is also live as well. So it's done all those three things at the touch of one button. And that is the power of macros. You can scale that as big as you want. You can have it doing 100, 200 things all at once, or even add pauses in between to start creating more complex automations. Now, one of the fundamental things to remember is actually how the ATEM is recording a macro. It's not watching you and saying you clicked on camera 1 and then 30 seconds later you enabled mic input 1 and then a minute after that you brought on the DSK. Actually, all it's doing is looking for state changes. So it's saying you cut to camera 1, you enabled mic 1, and you brought on the DSK. And it just writes those to a file. And that means that when you come to recall it, all of those things will happen at the same time, all at once. There's no timings involved. But the ATEM does have a feature to introduce timings, and they're called pauses. And these can be really useful. Let me show you one situation. So if we go to create a new macro here, I'm going to click the blank space, click the plus button again, and I'm going to create a macro that brings on our graphics, our live logo for 5 seconds, and then automatically brings it off of air. So we'll call this 5sec bug, then hit record. And so what we can do is we can bring our DSK on air, which will bring our live bug on air, like that. In fact, I'm going to change that. I'm going to make it fade on. So we can click auto. Then we're going to click this add pause button at the top here. And this will allow us to add a pause of 5 seconds, let's say. Just a thing to note, the column on the right-hand side here is frames and the column on the left-hand side here is seconds. So we can change that or keep that as 5 and then click add pause. And then we're going to click auto to bring our DSK back off air. And if we stop recording that, now when we go to the run tab, and run this, you can see our DSK comes on air. We have this orange border around to signify that the macro is still running. It waits 5 seconds and then brings the DSK off air. So that's the power of pauses. You can actually introduce timings in your macro. So you can say, do this, then wait a frame or a second, then do that. And this can be really powerful, especially when you're working with more complex macros where you actually do need to have things happen in order. So for example, with a Supersource, you might want to change the layout of your Supersource, but you don't want to do it at the same time as bringing it on air because then the viewer might see the layout change. So what you would do is create pauses so that the Supersource changes the layout behind the scenes and then it transitions it on air. And I can show you that as an example later on in the video. We've talked about creating and recording macros, but now I want to show you how to run macros and the different ways that you can do that. The one you've seen already is, of course, in the ATEM software control. So in the macro palette here, all you need to do is go to the run tab, and then you can see all of your macros down here. And as I mentioned before, if you've got recall and run enabled, you can just click on the macro to then run it. But if you don't, if you have it disabled, you need to click on the macro and then click the play button here to run the macro. That does give you a few more controls as well, because obviously you've got the stop button here. So if you have a particularly long macro or macro with multiple pauses in, you can actually stop it halfway through. The other button to take note on here is the loop button. You can actually have a macro just continually running. Once it gets to the end, it will start again. And that can be really useful for things like camera switching, where you just want to automate your cameras. And I'll show you that macro later on in the video because we're going to build it together. So using the ATEM software control is one way of doing it. if you have, as I mentioned before, the ATEM Mini Extreme ISO or the ATEM Mini Extreme model, you will notice on the front of your ATEM, you've actually got a macro section here. With these 6 buttons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, you have the ability to run the first 6 macros within your ATEM software control. So if I press number 3 here, you'll see now in the top corner, the live bug comes on for 5 seconds and then will go off. So that's a really easy way of running that macro directly from the front of the panel. Now for bigger shows and for ATEMs that don't have macro buttons on the front of them, there is also another way that you can get physical buttons to run your macros. And the most popular way is with one of these, a Streamdeck. It's made by a company called Elgato, and this particular version is the Streamdeck XL, and it gives me 32 programmable buttons. They've all got little LCD screens behind them, so I can fully customize how they look. And when you use this in conjunction with a piece of software called Bitfocus Companion, which is fully available for Mac, PC, and Linux, and it's free, you can basically load in your macros onto this and trigger them using the Streamdeck. So you have physical buttons, and also you've got a lot more buttons and you've got pages as well. So you can have 100 pages, each with 32 buttons on, giving you technically 3,200 buttons. Let me show you how easy this actually is. Companion is a little program that, as I say, runs on Mac, PC, and Linux, and this is the dashboard here. So I've already connected, in my connections, I've already connected my ATEM Extreme here. And now I can actually create the buttons. Now, usefully, they've got presets as well, so I don't even have to manually create these buttons. I can go over to preset, go over to my Blackmagic design, and then find where it says macros here, and it will automatically look at the ATEM software control and pull in all of the macros that are on my ATEM. So you can see it pulls in the name of all of them, and all 100 macros are here. Then all I need to do is just drag them over to the empty spaces. And you can see as I'm dragging them over on the desktop, they're actually populating on the physical device as well. So there's the 4 macros now that we created earlier as buttons on my ATEM. And just like we did before, I can show you them actually being triggered. So if we go over to here, now when I want to bring on the 5-second bug, all I need to do is press this. And you can see in the top right hand corner, we're now getting that bug. It stays green while the macro is running and then goes blue when the macro is finished running. This is a really powerful tool for complex productions when you've got multiple macros that you need to run. You can just have them all on one screen with physical buttons. Let me know in the comments if you want me to do more videos on Bitfocus Companion. I haven't really done many on my channel so far, but it is a really powerful tool for ATEM users. So let me know down below if you want some more videos on that. I've shown you the basics for recording and running macros, but what about editing macros? I had this question in from Benjamin when I put a post out saying I was doing a video on macros, who talks about if you make a mistake when recording, is there an easy way to actually change that macro without having to re-record it? The answer is yes. Let me show you how. So I've got my ATEM software control open here, and what I've actually done is I've created a quick macro that brings on a picture-in-picture DVE box in the top left-hand corner with camera number 1, but actually I made a mistake on purpose for this demonstration and I wanted to do it with camera number 2. So what I'm going to do is if I run it here, you'll see it puts the box on picture in picture, top left, custom sizing and position, but I actually want it to be camera number 2. I want it to be me rather than this overhead shot. So rather than re-recording the whole macro, we can actually export the macro XML file, make some tweaks to it, and then re-import it with the corrected version. So what I'm going to do, I'll show you how to do that. Let's bring this picture-in-picture off air. First thing you're going to do is go up to File up at the top, click on that, and we're going to click Save As. We're actually going to save out a restore file. And we'll just call this macro_v1, hit save. And here's the important part. We actually don't want any of these ticked right here apart from macros. So we can click select none up at the top and then just tick macros down here at the bottom. We only want to export the macro XML. Hit save, and then down in the bottom right, you'll see it's saving and it will say 100% complete when done. Now what we can do is edit this macro in a text editor, whether it be on Mac or PC. The one I like using here on Mac is ATEM. I find it really works really well, and it displays the text in a nice format. So I'm going to open that up, and then just drag in my macro file that I just saved. And this is our ATEM XML file just for macros. Now it looks a bit daunting here and full of stuff, but that's mainly because I've got a lot of macros in my ATEM. And some of them are quite long and complex. If you're new to macros, it won't look as daunting. But if I just scroll down, we'll get some more simplistic ones here. And you can see if I just highlight, let's see this one that we just made, this macro number 3, that is one macro. Between the macro index and the end macro tag here is one macro. And the macro index is basically the number of the macro, which is slightly different to where it shows in the ATEM software control, by the way. So you'll see if I scroll right up to the top, it starts on index number 0. But obviously, if we go to the ATEM software control and open up the macro palette again, this is actually box number 1, 2, 3, 4. So the index is always 1 out. That's just something to be aware of. So let's go back down to the one that we want to change, which is my PIP, this one here. So what we want to do is I would want to change the name because I want it to be camera 2, and at the moment it says C1. So I'm going to change that to C2. And I want to actually change the camera input as well so that it's always going to camera number 2 and not camera 1. I'll very quickly just explain the lines on here of what is happening in this macro. So we've got the index and we've got the name of the macro at the top there. You can add a description as well if you want. And then what's happening is the first line here is this part that we want to change. It's saying what camera should be in that box. So what that line is basically doing is changing this setting here. And then if we go back, the next line is, or the next 2 lines, are setting the position of the box. So we've got the X position and the Y position, and then the figures there. The 2 lines underneath that are setting the size of the box. So both of those are set to 0.25. And you'll see those numbers, again, if we go back to the ATEM software control, are all reflected of the same numbers in here. And then so that then sets all the settings of the box. And then I add in a 2-frame pause because I want all the settings and the box position to be set while it's not on air. So I add a 2-frame pause, and then I bring the upstream key on air. So what that line is doing is basically pressing this button here to bring it on air. So that is a quick description of what that macro that we've created is doing. Now we want to make the change. I want it to have camera 2 in the box rather than camera 1. So all I need to do, where I've got the input here at the top, I'm just going to change that to camera 2. And I'm actually going to rename this macro as well because I don't want it to be camera 1. I want it to be camera 2. You wouldn't have to rename it if you don't want to. The main change is actually changing the camera. So now that that's done, we can just go to File, Save. Oh, let's make sure I'm in ATEM. File, Save here. If you wanted to, you can do Save As and save out a new file. But I'm going to just save this one. And now we can go back to the ATEM software control. And we can close the macro palette for a second. Go to File, Restore. And we're going to bring that file back into the ATEM. And that's going to bring all the changes that we just made into the ATEM and save them. So we select that file, click Restore. It will only have macros ticked because that's all we exported, and then just hit Restore. So whereas before you'll remember that we had camera number 2, I think it was. Let's just check what we changed it to. Oh no, camera number 1, which was the overhead in the box. Now we'll have me, camera number 2, when we run this macro. So let's check that. We'll go to macros, go to run this macro, and there I am up in the top rather than the overhead shot. And we can confirm that as well by, if we go over here into the settings, we can see it has actually done that. And also you'll notice as well, it's changed to camera number 2 on the name. So you can see this is a really easy way to edit your macros if you've made a mistake, but also to actually expand on your macros in the future. If you want to add things to them, you don't have to delete them and re-record them. You can just go into the XML file and add the lines of code. It is a more advanced way of doing macros, but it does give you a lot more flexibility and saves you having to re-record them. So now you know how to record, edit, and run macros. Let's take a look at some of my top macro suggestions for 2023. But before we do that, let me talk to you about today's sponsor, QNAP. QNAP creates a wide variety of network-attached storage devices. A NAS, as they're known in short, is a bit like a giant hard drive that stores all of your data in one safe and central location, but it's connected to your network, so multiple people and devices can access and work from it at the same time, whether that be from home, in your office, or remotely from anywhere in the world. They offer a wide range of features like 10 gigabit Ethernet and Thunderbolt 3 connectivity for blisteringly fast file transfers, and a whole host of apps too, like my personal favorite, the hybrid backup and sync app, which will automatically take care of regularly backing up your data either locally or to the cloud. QNAP's NASes are scalable and flexible. You purchase the size of the NAS you need and then populate it with whatever hard drive sizes you require. Take my QNAP for example. I've got 5 of Western Digital's Red Plus 12 terabyte hard drives that give me a total of 60 terabytes worth of storage. Plenty for all my video editing projects. I've also fitted 4 Western Digital SSDs to get even faster read and write speeds thanks to SSD caching. I went with the Western Digital drives as they're optimized and specifically designed for use in a NAS enclosure and are tested for 24/7 use. If you want to find out more about my NAS setup and how it has completely changed the way I work, check out my video linked in the description below. There's also a link to QNAP's website below so you can check out their range of fantastic NASes in more detail. Big thanks to QNAP for sponsoring the video. On to my top macros for 2023. And I've already shown you the first one, which is my start show macro. I build it into pretty much every show that I create, whether it be for myself or my clients. And the idea of it is it to be a one button press for you to be able to just start the show without you having to be manic everywhere. So it does things like unmuting the correct microphone channels, transitioning from preview to program. So usually what will happen is I'll be on a VT, a video playing from my Hyperdeck. There'll be the opening titles, and then I hit that button to bring up the microphone, go to the correct camera, and bring in the graphics all at once. So I've shown you that one already, but on to the next one, and it actually links back to a question we've had in from Chip Labs, who says, looking forward to the video, maybe could you add in about how you can bring graphic assets in with macros? So I'm going to do a little demonstration and show you how to build these macros, but the idea that I'm going to show is switching between cameras, and at the same time as you switching between cameras, it's also changing the lower third, the graphic that names who's in the shot at the same time, so you don't have to do multiple things at once. So what I've done here in the media tab is I've created 2 little lower thirds that we're going to use. One is for my camera 1 and it says overhead shot, and one is for camera 2 and it says the main shot. And we're going to create macros that cuts to the correct camera and make sure the correct graphic is on screen as well at the same time. Really easy to do. So we're going to open up the macro palette again. I'm going to select this number 5 slot, click start new macro, and we're going to call this cam 1 and then hit record. And all we're going to do here is on the program, we're going to cut to camera 1. And then that's that done. Then in the media pool, I'm going to go there and I'm just going to drag in the correct one, which is camera number 1, over to media pool number 1. Now it's in there already, but we still have to do that because remember, the ATEM is recording state changes. So if we hadn't have done that, it wouldn't know that we've changed anything on the media players. Next thing, technically that's all we really need to do, but I am just going to show you what I'm using to do this. We're going to be using a downstream key. So I'm using media player 1 in the downstream key, so you'll want yours set up for media player 1 as well. Now the very last thing that we need to do is actually bring on that title. So I'm just going to click on air for the DSK. And if we cut back to the program, we should see, yeah, we're on camera 1 and we have the correct, lower third showing. Now, what we can do is stop recording now that we've confirmed that. So if I click stop recording, that's the first one done. Now we're going to do exactly the same thing, but for cam 2. So I'm going to select this blank space, create a new one, call it cam 2 this time, hit record. And then again, we're going to cut to camera 2 on the program. We're going to go into the media tab, this time selecting the correct graphic, which is in slot number 2 here, and dragging it over to media player number 1 so that it replaces it. And we're going to go back to the switcher. And even though the DSK is already on air, we're going to just bring it off and bring it back on. Because again, remember, the ATEM is recording state changes every time that we record a macro. So we want it to remember that it was last left on. and then we're going to stop the macro. Now we have two new macros here in slot 5 and 6. So if we switch to our program output, what we can see if we run these, go over to the run tab and we run these, cam 1 will go to the overhead and it will switch the lower third to the correct lower third. And then if I run cam 2 macro, it comes back to me and switches out the lower third to the corresponding and correct one, which is camera 2 main shot. And I can go back and forth between these as much as I like, and they will change in time. And the other beauty of it is because this is in slot 5 and 6, I can do this with the physical buttons on my ATEM Mini Extreme as well. So if we go over here, you can see that's number 5, number 6, number 5, number 6, and it's just working perfectly. So that is how you can incorporate macros with graphics. Next up, I'm going to show you a macro that I love using, which is using macros to build your Supersource templates. The first thing you're going to want to do is go into the ATEM software control and go into your Supersource settings and change your Supersource settings to make it look and the position of the boxes where you want them and what cameras you want in the boxes. So that's using all these settings down here. Now I've created a pretty simple layout of the overhead camera on the left-hand side and me slightly smaller and shrunk down and cropped on the right-hand side. Once you've got it looking how you want, we can actually get to the saving part. So what you need to do first of all is go up to File and then click Save As, because we're going to save out a restore file similar to how we did with the macros earlier. So I'm going to call this Super 2-Shot, give it a name, and then hit Save. Now, rather than ticking the macros box, we're going to click Select None, and we're just going to select Supersource here. That's the only one we want because we just want to write the Supersource data to the XML file. Then we can hit save, give that a few seconds to save, and that's, as I say, saving all of the Supersource data to the XML file. Then we can actually start recording our macro. So if we open up the macro palette again here, I'm actually going to do it in slot number 4 so that I can use this as a physical button as well. So we can create a new macro, and we'll call this Super 2 Box. Hit record. And now this is the important part. With the macro recording, we're going to bring in that restore file. So we go up to File, Restore at the top here. Select the file that we just created and click Restore. And then click Restore again. And that's sending all of those Supersource settings that we saved back into the ATEM. And it's recorded as a macro. Now we can click the stop button to stop recording the macro. And what we'll see is if I actually reset the Supersource to one of the defaults by clicking one of the defaults here, we can actually see we've got the default set, we've got 4 cameras on screen right now, but when I run this new macro, select that and click play, it automatically jumps to the layout that we saved. So this is a really simple but incredibly useful way of saving your Supersource layouts as macros. And then again, if I reset the Supersource here, and I click button number or macro button number 4 on the top of my ATEM, it works just the same. The final macro that I'm going to show you utilizes that loop function so that you can have a macro run continuously. And what I'm going to do is create a macro that cuts to a different camera every 5 seconds or so and just continuously runs through all of our cameras. So this is how you do it. We're in the macro palette again. We're going to create a new macro and just call this next camera. Hit record, and then in the program bus, we're going to select our first camera that we want the macro to go to. So in this case, it's going to be camera number 1. Then we're going to add a pause for how long we want it to stay on that camera for. So I'm going to select 5 seconds here. Add pause. Then we're going to just repeat the process really. So we're going to do the same for camera number 2 here. And we'll do this one for 3 seconds. Add a pause. Camera number 3. Add pause for another 3 seconds. And then we'll do camera number 4. Add pause for 3 seconds. Why not? And once we've done that, we can actually hit stop recording. So what that macro is doing is it's cutting to camera 1, waiting 5 seconds, then cutting to camera 2, waiting 3 seconds, cutting to camera 3, waiting 3 seconds, and cutting to camera 4, waiting 3 seconds. Now, the one thing to remember when you want to run this is to have the loop function here turned on. And that means it will continuously run the macro. When it gets to the end, it will just go straight back to the beginning. So let's run it and see what happens. So if we click next camera, hit play, it will cut to camera 1 here. Give it 5 seconds or so, and it will automatically cut to me on camera 2. Give it 3 seconds, and it cuts to my Blackmagic Cloud Store Mini, and then automatically cuts to camera 4, which is my computer. And you can see it's just going to work its way through, continually cutting through all of those cameras. So this is a great macro to use if you are a one-man band and you need to be in shot. Maybe you're playing a musical instrument, so you don't have hands free, but you want to have a multi-cam setup. You can just have this macro running, cutting between 2 or 3 cameras, and it just varies the shot for those watching on your live stream or on your recording. So there you have it. That is everything you need to know about recording, editing, and running macros, and some of my top macros for 2023. If you found this video useful, please do give it a thumbs up. It only takes 2 seconds, but it really does help. And if you're new here, don't forget, hit the subscribe button down below and turn on the notification bell for more videos just like this. If you've got a question about this video, definitely put it in the comments below. I read through all of them and will reply to as many of them as possible. And if you need specific help with your setup, maybe you want to create macros for your setup, my email address is on screen now. You can get in contact with me and we can arrange a one-to-one session where we can look at what your specific needs are for your setup. And once you've done all that, guys, I will see you on the next video.